Welcome. I am Scott DeRue, and I have the privilege of serving as Dean of the Michigan Ross School of Business. And this is a special time. It's a special day. It's a special moment where we come together for our annual Handleman Lecture Series. I want to welcome everyone who is joining us today. We have a number of students, over 1,000 undergraduates from our first year and sophomore class from BA 100 and BA 200. We have students from across the university, not just the business school, but across the university. We have community members throughout Ann Arbor, throughout the globe, joining us via our live stream on YouTube. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome Jacqueline Novogratz as this year's speaker. Now, this is a person that needs really no introduction, but to be brief, Jacqueline has had an amazing career and through her work has had a tremendous impact on our society and really elevating people and communities from poverty. A little bit of background. She's a best-selling author. She wrote a book that still to this day has really shaped how I think about equity and poverty in our society. Blue Sweater. If you haven't read it, highly recommended. Her latest book, Manifesto of a Moral Revolution. Business practices that can build a better world. There's no better time for this book to have been written, and no better symmetry with our mission here at the Ross School of Business to build a better world through business. Throughout her career, she has shaped how business can have an impact in society, and no more greater than the work that she's done with Acumen, founding and serving as CEO of Acumen, a venture fund that supports entrepreneurs, social enterprises, using markets, using business principles to elevate people and communities out of poverty. Jacqueline, it is my privilege, my honor to welcome you back to the University of Michigan and the Ross School of Business for our annual Handleman Lecture Series. Thank you for joining us.
Hello to everybody at University of Michigan and the Ross School. This is just wonderful at the beginning of the year. Thanks, Scott.
It's really become an annual tradition of bringing sort of the world's foremost thought leaders together, and you are certainly one of those. You made pretty much every top 20, top 100 list. Just to name a few as I was looking, top 100 global thinkers, 25 smartest people of our decade, 100 greatest living business minds. Jacqueline, I would love to start with the title of our discussion and our talk today, Business Leadership in Extraordinary Times. And there's some really powerful words in there, right? So the role of business, leadership, the times that we're in, what makes them extraordinary. So I'd love to just start with getting your thoughts on what is leadership and what is leadership at this moment in our history? What does that mean to you?
I would say in short, leadership is service. Leadership is using influence to bring people together and actually enable them to do things that they may not even want to do. In this, the skills of leadership, in a funny ways, are most made manifest by holding values in tension. So leadership is listening, but that listening also has to be balanced with making decisions, with leading. Leadership is humility, but that humility has to be balanced with audacity. Leadership is generosity, and that generosity has to be balanced with accountability. The one underlying, immutable, if you will, which goes to the second part of your question, is leadership is character. Leadership is doing what's right, not what's easy. And you know, I go all over the world, or used to, and now virtually do. And so many people say to me, but Jacqueline, where are our leaders? I look around and I don't see any leaders. And I would patently disagree with that. I see leaders in almost every community in which we operate. It's a different kind of leader who is excelling today, where I would say that I would look at them as more moral leaders, individuals who are recognizing that this is an extraordinary time and it requires an extraordinary kind of leadership that truly does make decisions on behalf of others, not self, that sees that moves away from this idea that I'm only right if I prove you wrong, that doesn't see the world in a zero-sum game, but recognizes that in this time of so much division, divisiveness, inequality, despair, it is the job of the leader to help us see possibility, but not in a naive and silly, optimistic only way, but in a hard-edged way that is rooted in the practical, the needs of building, not just for a few, but for all of us.
Yeah, thank you for that. And one of the things that to me is very striking about your perspective on leadership generally is this notion of tension, right? Humility with audacity, for example. If you reflect back on your career and your journey for a moment, how do you think you learned the ability to sit in the middle of that tension and have the audacity to create something like the Acumen Fund with the aspiration of changing the world, while at the same time having the humility to go into these communities that you work in with these entrepreneurs and really become a partner with them to empower them? How have you learned the ability to manage that tension of, say, audacity with humility?
That's such a great question. In a funny way, I grew up at a time in the world when we lived in separate spheres. So the skill set I grew up with was more one-sided. I would say that we had rich countries, poor countries, capitalism, communism. We had more binaries in a very specific way. I make my profit here and I give it away over there. Throughout the course of my life, Scott, I had experiences that kept flying into the face of these separate spheres and these separate certitudes, if you will. We're now at a point in history where there's elements of the rich and the poor countries in every nation on the planet. We have to change the way that we see these things. But there was probably no time in my life like Rwanda, where I had gone in my 20s to start the first microfinance bank in the country. And then the Rwandan genocide happened. And when I came back after the genocide, I had to confront that there are no good people and bad people, but that all of us have monsters and angels inside of ourselves. And maybe it's the broken, insecure parts that really are our monsters. And then in time of fear, scarcity, insecurity, it becomes really easy for demagogic leaders to prey on those insecure parts and sometimes make us do terrible things. That was a time of learning that the opposite of poverty, which was what I was there to try to eradicate, was not wealth. The opposite of poverty was dignity. And to build systems that enable people dignity means to build systems that enable people choice and opportunity. And neither would markets alone do that, because too often markets overlook or exploit, nor would top-down government nor charity do it alone, because too often that creates dependency, which is the opposite of dignity. And so all of that really came together with acumen, that if we were going to break all of these rules of separateness and use philanthropy, but invest it patiently for 10 to 15 years in entrepreneurs, who I think are so fundamental to the way we solve really complex problems. But that it would be important for those entrepreneurs and us to see low-income people not as passive recipients of charity, not idealizing them nor victimizing them, but having the humility to see them as part of themselves. And that would require a different kind of skill set, not to go in with the solution set, but with an open, inquisitive mind to understand, what do they value? How did they value it? How could they deliver a product or service in a way that was affordable, accessible, as we learned, beautiful, which is so often valued, so that people could ultimately solve their own problems and have their own choices. And so doing that requires a full-bodied skill set, Scott. That means you have to see the world you want to create, and that's audacious, but you have to have the humility to recognize the mess that is around you, including where people get in their own way, and including where you get in your way. And I think that that was the beginning of acumen.
One of the things that you said that was really powerful there was the idea that the opposite of poverty is not wealth, but it in fact is dignity. Could you talk a little bit more about that and shine a light on both how you came to that perspective, but then how it has shaped acumen and how you engage in communities around the world?
Um, I think in some ways I was coming to that perspective my whole life. You know, I grew up in a family where my grandmother had very little education, um, and yet she had this great strength of character. And I saw a dignity inside her, and I also saw how the world would like to um, put her in a different kind of category. No one wants to be called poor, and yet we have societies that vilify low-income people. And frankly, I use the word poor because we are living in a world where so many people are fully left out of our systems. But if we just go and try to save them or solve their problems, it's too easy to dehumanize in so doing it. But that as human beings, what we yearn for is to be seen, to be recognized. There was no place, as I said, like Rwanda, where I saw how easy it was to see other human beings as less worthy, ultimately less human, and how friends of mine were killed or were killers in those moments of just startling rage. And so that's when I started to think to myself, we're not doing a very good job of focusing on poverty if we put low income people in a box. And what I started to see was that poverty is just a word to describe a person's economic situation. It does not define their character. And in this moment of history, where we see ourselves putting labels on each other all across, I would say that rich people also can't just be defined by their financial success or their financial luck, but also by their character. And that what it really comes down to is, can we build a community that is truly diverse but allows a sense of wholeness within it? And at the heart of that may be the only shared value that we would have to agree on as a common minimum that is at least a starting point. And that is that every child deserves a life of dignity. Every child deserves a life where he or she or they can become their best self, whatever that means. And it's not so simple, because when I grew up, again, it was all defined for us with people who were pretty much all the same in an interdependent world. And I work with some of the most underprivileged, marginalized, conservative communities in the world. And I work with some of the wealthiest, mainstream, elite communities in the world, liberal communities in the world. That the kind of leadership that we need to master today is a leadership that recognizes that somehow we have to navigate these different belief systems, not from a place of righteousness, but going back to that North Star of human dignity. And that's why I think our collective starting point has to be to redefine success away from money, power, fame, which is what my generation helped define and get really good at, to one that insists on putting our shared humanity and the sustainability of the earth at the center of our systems. And if we could do that, everything would change.
Yeah, so much of it comes back to how we define success, how we think about our own identity in the societies and in the communities within which we live. And you and I have had a chance to chat about this in the past, but one of the things I've always been really fascinated about with regards to your career, as I think about the journey that many of our students at the University of Michigan and certainly the Ross School of Business, the journey that they are on, is there's so much pressure in our society that they need to go to this career or that career and so forth. And in some sense, they don't even know what that career means, and it may not be tied to a sense of personal values and the aspirations that they have and the impact that they want to have in their life. And if I look at your career and the choices that you've made, you started in banking, a very traditional route for business school students, undergraduate and graduate. And then you began to make career choices that leveraged, in many ways, the skill set that you had begun to develop, but in ways that would connect with your values and your aspiration and vision for what was possible through business, through markets, to really make a difference in the world. Where did you find, one, the courage to make some of those shifts, because you're living in a world where success is defined for you in ways that are almost counter to the choices that you're making? So how did you find the courage to make that shift, and how have you navigated your career ultimately to founding Acumen and having this very clear North Star and sense of purpose that you embody today?
I think maybe the courage started as a little girl in terms of what my role models were. And I think that's why role models are so important. I would read, and there weren't a lot of women role models when I was a little girl, certainly not alive ones in terms of what I wanted to do. And the ones that I would look to, Eleanor Roosevelt, Harriet Tubman, Elizabeth Blackwell, first woman doctor, Jane Addams of Hull House, they took on problems so big they might not complete them in their lifetime. And what they don't teach us when we're little is that when you commit to something so big, it doesn't constrain you, it actually sets you free. And so I would say, first, seeing that other people had made these commitments to big ideas, and that within that they found a freedom, allowed me to start to see the North Star, if not the path, because as you said, my path was all over the place. Second, I do think I was very lucky to come from this big, chaotic, crazy, but very loving and supportive family. So no matter how badly I fell, I think I knew there was a place to go home to. That's not the case with everyone. And so I just want to acknowledge that. It definitely still took courage to tell immigrant Catholic military family, parents, that I was leaving my great job to move to a continent no one had ever been to in our family before the age of cell phones or the internet. But I actually think that if you practice courage, you get more courage. And when I look at some of the courageous change makers in my life today, there's a narrative that goes back to the hard conversations often many of them had with their parents early on. And so you see that you're still alive the next day, you're still working. And so I think courage builds on courage, Scott. The second piece was I wanted to create a world where all low-income people were seen as full human beings with inherent dignity, where we were solving problem. I will not be successful if I define myself in terms of actually solving that problem. But along the way, I have been given so many extraordinary opportunities to learn, to grow, to deepen. And I guess it's that combination of purpose, of practicing courage, and then I would combine it with doing work I love with people I love and respect. My team, the community around acumen, which now is hundreds of thousands strong, but the core of who we are, it all amplifies, it reinforces. And so you might start off feeling crazy and alone, but over time you feel that you have helped create the world that, at least on a microcosm, you want to live in and you want to model.
Yeah, and it's so important, especially in this moment that we're in now. And if we titled this session "Leadership in Extraordinary Times," and these truly are extraordinary times. I mean, a global pandemic that has reshaped how we live, how we work, how we connect with each other. I mean, you and I would normally be sitting in front of 3,000 people on a stage together, right? And now we're here virtually, and so it's really changed everything. It's in some sense, it's devastated communities and families. And to everyone who's joining, I hope that all of your loved ones and families are doing well in these really challenging and trying times. So we have a global pandemic. We have racial injustice and social unrest in all different forms across the globe. We have a divisive political landscape that is really pitting communities against each other and sectors of our society against each other. To your earlier point, zero-sum, win-loss type of mindset. You work with some of the greatest change agents that we've ever seen, that start maybe in micro ways in small communities and scale up in ways that are really changing society in powerful and positive, profound ways. When you look at the change agents that you're working with, what can we learn from them about leadership that we so desperately need in order to bring people together at this moment in our history as opposed to dividing them? What do we need from our leaders today?
It's such a great question, and it's such a great question to be having with you and with university and business school students, because I actually think that we, in this moment, we need to redefine what our hard skills and our soft skills are. And I would say that the hard skills of today are the skills around building character. So we've talked about the holding, listening is so critical, and we're not listening enough to one another. The skills of identity. And by that, I mean really understanding that none of us are a single identity. We have many identities within ourselves. But those identities align, and they end up lining up almost in a hierarchy. When one part of ourselves is threatened or feels threatened, it rises to the top of our hierarchy of identities, and that's all we become. And sometimes we do it to ourselves, and sometimes we do it to other people. And how we see others hugely defines how they might see themselves. And so leaders of today that are dealing with diverse communities and are looking to create sustainable, equitable, functional companies, organizations, universities, have to know themselves and their different identities, using different pieces of them to connect to others as a starting point, as a way of connecting. One of my, you'll hear me refer to the Sufis, but Rumi, the Sufi poet, said, "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the ocean in a drop." Each of us contains multitudes. And in this moment of such anger and divisiveness, it is to the leader to extend ourselves as a bridge, to find that starting point, which can sometimes be distasteful, if not just uncomfortable. And that really goes to what you had talked about before, this holding tensions. I am not by any means saying that there are no principles that are not immutable. What I'm saying is that the only way we will have conversations that get us to solutions that bring us together is to develop a skill set that starts by listening to what the other says. And even if we're on wildly different sides And as you can imagine, in my life, I have been on wildly different sides. Can I acknowledge even a tiny truth in what the other side is saying? Can I walk toward that person? And if I do, it tends to open up a space where at least dialogue can happen. As you know, when I started Acumen, so many people thought I was crazy 19 years ago. And with great certainty, some of the more successful businessmen in the world, who had already intimidated before I walked into their office, would calmly explain to me that I didn't understand anything about business, because you make your money here and you give it away there. And what I was talking about, looking at stakeholders, was completely muddled, had no discipline, and would never work. And when I would let the alpha, the bull in me, get defensive and just go at them, neither did I raise any money, nor did I bring anybody along with me. When I could say, you know, for many, many years, there's great truth to what you're saying. However, we're facing climate change, we're facing deep levels of poverty, and I want to work in places where both markets and government have failed. And so I might fail, but give us a shot here. Some of the people who then were my biggest naysayers came along and now are the greatest advocates. But had I started with, you know, you think I'm stupid, I'm going to tell you how stupid you are, we would never have gotten out of the room with anything but our own petty ideologies and trite assumptions reaffirmed.
Yeah, you end up talking either past each other or in some sense against one another, and it becomes that zero sum mindset that then becomes limiting, where we can't make any progress together. And so one of the things that's really powerful about what you're saying is the willingness and the ability to lean in and listen to someone and acknowledge and give them a sense of dignity will open up conversations where they can do the same in return back to you. And we've got a lot of people who are trying to talk at as opposed to listen and engage in an honest dialogue of ideas.
There's so many entrepreneurial people in this younger generation and at University of Michigan that, if we're only talking about America for a moment, that within the entrepreneurial ideal is the spirit of America, is this can-do spirit. And the most successful entrepreneurs are not ideological. They focus on the problem they want to solve. They understand the people they are there not to help, but to serve. Then they find the right kind of the capital. Do I need nonprofit, or should it be a for-profit? It is not from an ideological base. It is from a pragmatic base, all in service of something clear and bigger than them. And then they just keep doing it. They learn how to partner with people they might never have thought they were going to partner with. I could put myself in that category. And they sometimes find that those individuals, as I said, might be their best partners. That, I actually think there's a story that could help create more unity through business as a tool for change. And I'm certainly seeing business as a tool for peace in post-conflict Colombia that was just devastated by 50 years of civil war. And now I go into the post-conflict areas where Acumen has a number of very successful companies today. And there's no better way to get people to start to learn to talk to each other and trust to each other than to share a common endeavor. Asking them to, hold hands and play pretty doesn't really cut it.
No, the cooperation, the interdependency that's required in business relationships and businesses generally creates a social fabric that you can actually build on to change communities and societies in powerful ways. And I think Acumen is a living testament to that in many ways. Jacqueline, one of the things that you mentioned is you used a term stakeholder that is often held in contrast or tension with shareholder. And one of the things that in the last year or so, some have tried to make ideological is this question of really what's the purpose of business and who does it serve? Does it serve its shareholders alone, or does it serve a broader network of stakeholders, including but not limited to its shareholders? How has your perspective on that matter evolved over time? And what's your perspective on the debate that has happened globally, but certainly here within the United States around this shareholder versus stakeholder mindset and view of business?
It's such a great question. As I said, when I started business school 30 years ago, Berlin Wall had just fallen, capitalism had won. We all studied Milton Friedman in my ethics class. The right answer to our job was to maximize shareholder wealth from an ethics perspective, not just a legal nor just a fiduciary perspective. Over time, I saw that particularly in the age of accelerating technology, where these two forces of capitalism and technology, while doing enormous good and creating enormous freedom, which is what Friedman really wanted it to do, also created a level of inequality that is unsustainable. And climate change, which was the one piece that you didn't talk about at the beginning because you had so many other challenges that we're facing. And so when you think about how do we build systems and societies that include the poor and vulnerable and help us stave off catastrophic climate change, then a stakeholder model becomes an inevitability. In some ways, I feel that it is being used as an ideological weapon. But the truth is, the train has left the station. It is now impossible to hire the next generation without making a commitment to sustainability, without making a commitment to community. And increasingly, customers do not want to buy from companies that do not think about community, employees, and the planet. And so the opportunity for business is to lead right now. I have seen corporations and businesses around the world start to set standards long before government catches up to those standards. And in some ways go back to the way business operated in the 1940s, where great CEOs saw themselves as citizens first, and they behaved as corporate leaders, individual citizens that were there with great privilege and therefore bore enormous responsibility. And so in a way, Scott, it's how do we get away from these polarities, these conversations that are almost set up to divide us, and rather go underneath to who do we want to be as a society, as a family, as a community, as a university, as a corporation, as a nation, as a world. That if we can get a little bit more vulnerable, including when we partner across lines of difference, corporations, social enterprise like Acumen does all the time, it's so much more powerful when we start with what we're good at, what we're not so good at, and most importantly, the purpose for which we are sitting at the table, what we think the risks are, and the values that we're bringing. And I think if we had those conversations, we could get a whole lot more done.
Yeah, we certainly would. And I'd be interested in your perspective on the following. One of the points that I've often made about this debate is time horizon matters. And one of the things I've always respected and admired about Acumen, and really one of the guiding principles that I think you founded the vision on, is patient capital, right? And you're investing in entrepreneurs and enterprises with a longer time horizon towards seeing the change that you want to see. In the 1940s and 50s, the business leaders that you're referring to, in most cases, had a longer horizon for what they were looking to build and the impact they were looking to have. The systems that we have largely created today have shifted that horizon to, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, a shorter time horizon, from everything in terms of how we compensate people to how we value markets and companies within them and the like.
It's all transactional.
Exactly. Short-term transactional. How do you think about time horizon, and how has it shaped what you do at Acumen?
First, let me be clear. I'm a very impatient person. And so it's not that I think, well, we can just wait until things happen. You have to push the inevitable. And when I started Acumen, I thought patient capital was 7, 8 years, maximum 10. Now we look at, if you are starting to build a new sector altogether, which is what we did with off-grid solar electricity, you're looking at 10 to 15 years, really even before you hit the J curve. And what I've learned about that is 10 to 15 years looking forward sounds like an eternity. 10 to 15 years going back goes like that. And so I think about these two young guys that came into our office with a $30 solar torch, like a flashlight, and this dream to eradicate kerosene that was what 1.5 billion people across the planet relied on for their fuel and their light. We had nothing to bet on except for character. I loved their audacity and I saw their humility. These were two guys that would listen. I would say for the first 4 or 5 years, we would have, inside conversations. Will they go bankrupt this year or next year? We came to understand that capital isn't enough. And again, we so often have, especially investors, we have these conversations as if it's all about the investment dollars, that we had to accompany the entrepreneurs from a relational perspective. We had to find them really strong talent to compensate where they couldn't afford to hire talent. We had to use our social capital, not just our financial capital. Who did we know? What corporations could help sell these things along their supply chain? What designers might help them redesign to make things even more affordable for low-income people? And so we were betting on what I would call their moral imagination, their ability to put themselves in another's shoes and build from that person's perspective, not just the lens of their own imagination. But we were also almost using an ethos of giving more than we would extract. And we did it we invested in 2007, it's 2020, so we're 13 years in. But that single company not only has brought light and increasingly electricity to 100 million of the lowest income people around the world, but it helped spawn an entire industry. We were able to grow with them so that we're the largest off-grid solar energy investor for the poor in the world. We were then able to create a $70 million for-profit impact fund so that we could help scale companies like D-Light and help them raise $50 million at a time instead of $1 million at a time. And I realized that we were helping them not just build a company, but an entire ecosystem. And that is how change is made. But it's long-term, it's purpose-driven, it's measuring what matters, and it's caring about stakeholders.
Yeah, it's really, and that's a powerful example to illustrate the importance of that long-term horizon. Because if you were a short-term investor, you might have pulled the plug on that company before they were able to learn, before they were able to begin to scale, because you thought they might go bankrupt the next year or whatnot. And so this notion of time horizon, whether you're an investor or a leader building an organization, or an employee in any type of organization, nonprofit, for-profit, really taking a long-term horizon on change, but with the impatience that you're describing, where you know that you need and want to see change now. And being able to hold those two things in parallel, I think, is really important.
And Scott, as I see some of the words coming in about development and empathy, again, these are skills not just for the social entrepreneurs at the beginning, but I've been invited into a number of conversations over the last year with Fortune 100 CEOs who are both looking to redefine and in some cases retrofit their purpose statements. And also they'll ask me the question, you know, in a way, Jacqueline, it's easier for you to start from a zero baseline and build, but I have this very complex entity. How does a big corporation that has been built on shareholder value move towards stakeholders? And I would say it's the same principles, that if you can really clarify what your purpose is and then make decisions for the long term, not the short term. And I do think that these quarterly shareholder meetings are really poisonous to enable the kind of long-term strategic planning and investment in talent and community that's needed for our CEOs to thrive, so that their companies can thrive with them.
Yeah, and it's possibly one reason, certainly not the only, but possibly one reason why we've seen a decrease in the number of public companies over the last decade or so, is because people are recognizing the perils of public ownership being owned by a relatively small set of entities. So what's public, what's not, would be an interesting debate for us to have at another time. One of the things that you and I have talked about in the past is this notion of failure. And one of the things that I've really observed in my time here at the University of Michigan is how many of our students, and I would say human beings generally, a fear of failure, or a tolerance for risk, where we want to do the things we know we can do well, almost to demonstrate to the world that we're good, right? And being able to balance that fear with the audacity that you're talking about. And I know you're someone that views failure as part of the journey and a way to learn, grow, and develop. Could you talk about how you think about failure in your life, in your career, and how you approach those moments in a way to learn and grow from them?
Sure. If there were a single rule, I would say that if you rule out failure, you rule out success as well. And so if you hold to that, then it almost behooves you to fail. There's a funny story, I'll try to keep it short, Scott, but when I wrote Blue Sweater, one of our fellows working at a toilet company in Nairobi started speaking to a guy from the slums who was asking him what he did and what he was trying to explain patient capital. Finally, he got frustrated and he said, "Can you read?" The guy says yes. And he's like, "Well, my boss wrote this book and I know her. So she'd be really happy if you read it and you send her what you think about it." So a few weeks later, I get this long text from the Nairobi slums. And in it, he says all these things, but he ends by saying, "If you could fail as many times as you have failed, it gives me great hope. Because I'm HIV positive, I have a third grade education, and I'm unemployed. But when I see what a failure you were, and then how much you accomplished in your world, then it makes me think that I too can be part of solving, bridging the gap between rich and poor." And I was so moved because, of course, I had written this book thinking that my protagonists were everybody else and people with HIV positive who had done just unbelievable things. But Kevin related to me. And and what a gift it was. And what I realized in that is by not only being daring enough to fail, but honest enough to share your failure, that's when you can also inspire other people that they too can be part of change. I see some young, ambitious leaders feel the need to be the smartest person in the room all the time. And while people might leave the rooms thinking, well, that person's smart, it's rare that they say, and I want to follow that person, because they're not being engaged. There's no vulnerability. There's no real conversation. And so it can be as easy as practicing courage, particularly for the first and second year students here of U of M, to ask the stupid question. Because so often in my life, when I ask the stupid question, I realize it's the question that's on everybody's mind. But it can be very scary, particularly in this world of social media where we feel judged by everything. And that, I think we need not just patient capital, but we need a bit more patience in our shared humanity, where we make time for conversations, where we make time to be uncomfortable. And so just as I would say that failure allows progress, I would say let discomfort be a proxy for progress. And I have so many stories of where along the path with Acumen, we would take a bet on a digital hearing aid, and think this was going to be our great success story, only discover that low-income people have the same kind of vanity that anybody else does, and didn't feel the need for a hearing aid, and so failed. So it was like, okay, if technology isn't the answer, it's the distribution, it's the delivery of technology in ways that people can afford. We failed by thinking affordability was everything. If we could get things cheap enough, people would want it. But human beings make decisions based on status, beauty. And so how could we then design from the perspective of low-income people so that they would use it? In public health, we always talk about shoulds. It doesn't really matter if someone's telling us what we should do. Can we design a company and a service delivery system so that people want to do the right thing? And so we would never have learned that.
I've got one more question, and it comes from some of the comments that I'm tying together from the students. But I'm going to relate it back to your latest book, Manifesto, which is a powerful word in and of itself. And I bet you spent a good amount of time thinking about the use of that word. Manifesto for a moral revolution. What is the moral revolution that we need at this moment in our history that motivated you to write the book?
We're at a moment in history where we know that our current institutions have largely run their course, yet we've not reimagined with what to replace them. So for this next generation that is starting out, for those who want to lead, there unfortunately is no roadmap, no how-to guide. Those early business guys were right. Having a single metric by which you are making all of your decisions profit, it makes things a lot simpler. You can have that discipline. But if you are trying to build an equitable health system where a mom who has no money doesn't have to see her little girl die because she can't afford the medicine she needs in that moment. And in my world, that medicine might cost 10 cents. That we have to do better than having a single metric. And so because there's no roadmap, all we can offer is a compass. And that compass has to be a moral compass. By moral, I do not mean a set of rules prescribed from on high, nor do I mean my belief system versus your belief system. What I mean is a framework that puts our shared humanity and the sustainability of the earth at the center, not profit, of all of our systems. That is the kind of revolution. It is not a revolution from on high nor from below, but it is a revolution from inside. It requires that we practice a discipline and build a skill set that is full of the competencies that people learn at our universities. But the competencies must be married with the kind of character that is willing to be uncomfortable, to listen, to hold tensions, to understand identity, to have these big dreams, but have the humility to understand that it takes a long time. And maybe most important is the resiliency and the grit, that when you're 22 or 25 or 35, we often think, I'll do this for 3 years and then I'll have like done my thing. And then 30 years later, you're thinking, I wish I had another 60 because I'm only getting started. And so I would say it's a moral revolution that starts by revolutionizing the way we see each other. All of us as whole human beings with all of our flaws and imperfections, and that we find our way to a world worthy of the interdependence and the interconnectedness that recognizes that our actions and our inactions impact people every day, not just in community, but across the world. And so we need a whole new operating system that allows all of us to thrive.
Jacqueline, thank you so, so much. I have such deep gratitude and appreciation for you as a person and as a professional, and everything that you've done in your career and will do going forward. On behalf of everyone at the University of Michigan and the Ross School, welcome back. We look forward to the day where we can interact in a three-dimensional space, not just a two-dimensional space. But your words of wisdom, your humility, your thoughtfulness, your leadership for change and positive impact in the world is such a perfect fit with our DNA, our aspiration to build a better world through business and business principles, and to really develop that next generation of leaders that Acumen will fund one day, and partner with them to help change the world in really positive ways. Thank you for joining us today and really engaging our community. I know I speak for everyone when I say thank you from all of us, from the bottom of our hearts.
Well, thank you so much. And as I said to you before, when I went to Ann Arbor, I really felt a sense of home because of everything that you've said. I thought, this is my tribe. And to think about the many students that are starting off with this spirit that we don't get to choose what happens to us, but we do get to choose how to respond to what happens, that this is your moment. This is the moment to start to dream about the world that we shape together. And I look forward to staying in touch and hearing about some of the great innovations and collaborations that come out over the next years, but just couldn't feel more honored to be part of this, and definitely look forward to the time I get to interact with a whole lot of people in person and with you. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jacqueline. And to everyone who joined us, thank you for joining us. Hopefully you found this conversation insightful and inspiring. I know I did. And on behalf of everyone here at the Ross School, thank you, and forever and always, go blue.